Alright, this is IMAX Nation 1980 here. Moving on with the Beatles records, and after that, we're gonna go into the solo Beatles albums. So, we left off at 1967 to 1970, the blue vinyl edition, so I'm gonna pick up again with the Beatles Rock and Roll Music. This is another compilation album, and the album cover, it's controversial because it depicts the Beatles in a 50s manner, and the Beatles define the 60s. The Beatles were definitely in their early roots in the 50s as the Quarrymen. But I find it kind of weird that was the package design. I think John Lennon submitted a cover to EMI, but they ultimately rejected it. This was also part of the Greatest Music Ever Sold campaign. And here we have the Beatles live at the Star Club in Hamburg, Germany. It's not really a legitimate record, but it's not really a bootleg either. It's on a label called Bellaphon, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right because I think it might be pronounced a different way. And this is, of course, in the American version is a little bit different from the UK version in the track listing. And this album, it goes for a pretty penny, like on eBay and stuff like that. It's a concert that supposedly was recorded. Like the person recording the concert had the tape recorder on his lap. That's what I heard. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, it's a pretty good release. It's an important record, although the sound quality isn't the greatest. Here we have the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl, one of the only live Beatles albums, that and Live at the BBC. I think the reason why EMI and Capitol issued this album was because in 1971 a Beatles album appeared in Italy called The Beatles in Italy, but it was nothing more than a mere compilation. But Beatles collectors thought, oh, is it a live album? They were thinking to themselves, is that a live album? And that, I think even John Lennon himself accidentally said it was a live album. Either that or he was saying it wasn't. I'll have to read that story again. Pretty interesting nonetheless. And here we have Rarities. Rarities is an interesting album. In 1978, Rarities was an album that came with a Beatles box set in the UK. And it had a blue cover, and what it contained was B-sides, and it was kind of like the precursor to the Past Masters series. So it was released in the United States in 1980, and it contained some rare B-sides. It also contained the German version of She Loves You, and it also had the charity version of Across the Universe with the animal sound effects at the beginning. And it also has the Sgt. Pepper Inner Groove Nonsense. And it also includes different mixes of certain songs, and it has songs that were previously on the VJ albums that did not appear on the early Beatles. It's an interesting album nonetheless. Alright, now the solo Beatles albums. Right here is John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band. His first, real solo album, because the first couple albums that John Lennon did were a couple avant-garde experimental albums. And not that I have anything against avant-garde music. I think the first one, the Two Versions album, is kind of interesting. The rest, I'm not really I don't really care much. Like the Wedding album, I don't really care for those albums. And then there was Live Peace in Toronto. But this was like the first full album of music that he did after the Beatles. Here we got Imagine, a very successful follow-up. And of course, the iconic title track. A classic album. I have 2 copies of this. Both the same. No real big differences. There's Mind Games. That's a reissue copy from the later 70s. Mind Games I don't think it's a great album, but I think it's still pretty decent. It was recorded during the Lost Weekend. Kind of a tough time in John Lennon's life. This and Walls and Bridges were recorded during the Lost Weekend. And I don't know if the majority of Rock and Roll was recorded during the Lost Weekend or part of it was recorded during the Lost Weekend. I'll have to look into that again. Correct me if I'm wrong. Here we got Double Fantasy, which is credited to John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And of course it was John Lennon's last album. There was a semi-sequel, Milk and Honey, that was released after John Lennon's death. It was way later in 1984, though. I have a couple carbon copies of it. I hold on to carbon copies of my records because if one wore out or something, if I was playing it, 'cause I play my vinyls too. Not just collect them, I play them. This one is sealed. Not sealed, but it's got the shrink wrap on it and the price sticker. We got the John Lennon collection. And this is a greatest hit album. And I'm not sure, but I think the version of Number 9 Dream on here is like cut down to 2 minutes, and that was corrected for the CD. I'm going to check right now, see. I think it's listed in its right. Yeah, it's listed as, you know, the usual 4.5 minutes, but I think it was shorter on this album, believe it or not. I heard there was like a mistake. I think it was on early pressings or so. Here's McCartney, Paul McCartney's first album. And this is a good album. I think it's kind of underrated in a way. Most of it was recorded at his house, and he played all the instruments. And it's got some Beatles leftovers on there, like Teddy Boy. You can hear the Beatles, the version he did with the Beatles on, I think it was Anthology 3. I'll have to check again. The rest of the songs on here are great, though. Good stuff. And just my opinion, Paul is my favorite Beatle after the breakup. He's my favorite solo. I like John Lennon's a lot, but Paul McCartney is my favorite. And I also really like Harrison, and some of Ringo's stuff is really good too. I mean, I saw Ringo in concert and he was phenomenal. There's Ram, Paul McCartney's second album. This is credited to Paul and Linda McCartney, and it's arguably one of his best albums, if not his best. And it was ripped apart by the critics when it was first released in 1971, but it was a huge seller nonetheless. Nowadays, critics consider it Paul McCartney's masterpiece. It's a great album, and I got 3 copies of it. And you want to know how I get carbon copies of records? Well, when a lot of my relatives found out that I was collecting records, they didn't know what to do with their records, so they just ended up giving them to me. And sometimes they'd have a record that I already have, so it makes a nice addition. So if one copy wears out, not that it will, but just in case. Okay, here's Wildlife, the first album by Wings. Wings lineup included Denny Laine and Denny Seiwell. And Wildlife got even worse reviews than Ram. It was called a terrible album, and it didn't sell as well as Paul McCartney had hoped. It's, tell you the truth, it's not really a bad album. I mean, sure, it sounds a little rushed, and I think the album was recorded in 3 weeks, I remember reading. And I don't know if it was ever revealed who Clint Harrigan is. I've heard some rumor that it was Paul McCartney himself, but that was on Wikipedia, and it had a citation source needed caption next to it, so I don't know if it's true or not. Not that I'm saying Wikipedia is false, but if it says next to it citation needed, then that means there has to be a source for that claim. If you know who Clint Harrigan is, if he's Paul McCartney or someone else, please tell me. Okay, we got Red Rose Speedway. Since Wildlife didn't sell so well, it had to be credited to Paul McCartney and Wings. This sticker right here was actually on this section of the album. Didn't come like this. My uncle who gave it to me found the sticker somewhere, so I just put it in the protective sleeve. And to tell you the truth, the cover, I think it's pretty funny. Some people think it's kind of silly. I think it's alright. And it's a good album. I think it's another underrated Paul McCartney album. It's got some really good songs on there. And two of the songs on there, Get on the Right Thing and Little Lamb Dragonfly, are Ram outtakes, although with some modifications. And Wings lineup added Henry McCullough. And got Band on the Run, arguably one of Paul's greatest, if not his greatest. It's a real work of art. Unfortunately, Wings was only down to Paul, Linda, and Denny Lane this time. Denny Sywell and Henry McCullough left the band. I think it's because McCartney wanted to record the album in Lagos, Nigeria. I hope I pronounced that right anyways. And I don't think they wanted to go to Nigeria with him, so they left the band. I'll have to read that story again. This is another copy of it. Carbon copy. Venus and Mars, which came out roughly 2 years after Band on the Run. It was another album that was a big hit. Of course, it had a huge hit single on it. Listen to What the Man Said. There's a carbon copy there with no cover. I couldn't just throw it away. It was in good condition, so I kept it in that stock sleeve there. Wings at the Speed of Sound, which featured two big hits, Let 'Em In and Silly Love Songs. It's not the greatest album, but it's still pretty decent. And here we got Wings Over America, triple record set. And I like it. It's got a lot of great performances. And it's got performances of Beatles tunes as well. I like the version of Lady Madonna on here. This is a very big set. Very thick. London Town. And another copy of London Town. And Back to the Egg. This is when Paul McCartney kind of went with the whole punk new wave, the trend when it started coming in the late 70s, going into the early 80s. And this album got terrible reviews when it came out, and it actually was disappointing in the sales. It's not a bad album, actually. Parts of it are pretty fast and pretty rockin'. I don't understand why I don't think it's a terrible album. Even Paul at his worst can still be pretty good. Yeah, it's a pretty decent album. I mean, even if it is his worst, it's still decent. Still has some really strong tunes on it. Alright, stick around for the next part. This is IMAX Nation 1980, signing off.